My guest today is Steve Schwartz of the LSAT blog and the LSAT Unplugged podcast and YouTube channels. And we're going to link to them from the show notes at accept.com/415. Now, Steve graduated from Columbia University in 2008. In high school and college, he tutored students in a variety of subjects and also helped prep test takers for standardized tests, including the LSAT. However, he really began to focus on the LSAT when he was applying to law school. He founded the LSAT blog in 2008 and never looked back. Today, 13 years later, he has helped thousands master the LSAT, get into law school, and sometimes secure scholarships worth tens of thousands of dollars. Steve, welcome back to Admission Straight Talk.
Thanks so much for having me back on, Linda. Great to see you again.
Great to have you. Now, we spoke almost exactly 1 year ago when the Flex LSAT was new. Corona was new. At the time, we discussed the new and remote Flex LSAT. Today, we're going to discuss the demise of the Flex LSAT. What gives?
I mean, basically, the Flex was always kind of meant to be temporary, and I think that's why LSAC gave it the Flex name to distinguish it from the normal regular LSAT. But here we are, 1 year later. COVID-19 is unfortunately still with us to some extent, although hopefully things will be looking better later this year with the vaccine rollouts and such. But LSAC, they can't keep administering the LSAT without experimental sections. They've got to be able to test out future questions. So starting in August this year, they're adding back in an experimental section, and they're going to start calling it just the LSAT again.
Got it. And how is the LSAT going to be different from the Flex LSAT, given that they are both remotely proctored exams, I should say?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very small difference. I don't want people to get overly stressed about it. It's still the same question types, the same difficulty level. So you're going to have logic games, logical reasoning, reading comprehension like before. It'll still be the same length of 35 minutes per section, but the overall test sitting will be longer by adding back in that fourth unscored experimental section. They'll also insert a break between the second and third sections. So the length gets a little bit longer, maybe 10-minute break plus another 35 minutes for that fourth section. So test takers are looking at roughly a 45-minute longer exam. But as you said, it'll still be online.
And entirely online. Are there any in-person testing centers planned for those who prefer that?
Not currently. At the moment,
Okay.
I don't think that we'll see any for quite a while, but LSAC indicates that they're open to the possibility, although they still will keep the online option we're expecting. And they've said it'll be online through at least June 2022. But this is still much shorter than the pre-COVID LSAT, which had 5 sections, 4 scored, 1 unscored experimental. Now the LSAT for the foreseeable future will have 3 scored sections plus 1 unscored experimental section.
Got it. It's very interesting from my perspective. GMAC with the GMAT, you have an option to take it in person or remotely. MCAT is entirely, the medical aptitude test is entirely in person. There's no remote possibility. I think GRE has both, but I'd have to look. And LSAC is entirely remote. So it's like each one has a different approach.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many logistical things for them to deal with that I can understand. I mean, on the one hand, I think it's nice to give people options. On the other hand, it's a lot of work to offer it in multiple contexts. And in person, the logistics of doing it that way, booking the testing centers, especially when the LSAT, unlike some of the others, I mean, if I understand correctly, the GRE is virtually every day. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, so the LSAT's not even every month. It's almost every month. So They don't have that same level of regularity. It's like things are kind of ad hoc for each time they're doing it.
I think there are also many more GRE test takers.
Yes.
Just yes. So many more subjects. But yeah.
Yeah, the economies of scale.
But again, looking, stepping back and looking at the landscape overall, it's kind of interesting how each one has chosen a different path.
Yeah, confusing for people who want dual degrees, right?
Right, that's for sure. That's for sure. Go for the GRE. Now, will applicants know which section is experimental?
So that's the thing. I'm glad you raised that question. They will not know during the exam. They will not know whether that unscored extra section is going to be games, reasoning, or reading comp. And they also don't know where in the exam it'll be. So it could be your first section, you're doing it, and it's unscored. It could be the last section, in which case at least you've already gotten through the stuff that mattered to you. Or it could be somewhere in the middle. And they don't tell you which section it's going to be, because if they did, you probably wouldn't try as hard. And then that would affect their ability to benefit from the results of what you're doing. They want to be able to see how you perform.
So every test will have 4 different sections, and just one of the sections will be unscored.
That's right. So there's going to be 3 types of sections, but one of them you're going to get twice. So at the end,
then you'll know that one of those 2 is the test.
Exactly. So after all said and done, you're going to know, okay, well, if I had 2 logic game sections, one of those was the fake one. You're just not going to know which one it is. But let's say you do logic game section 1, logic game section 2. Well, then you know the reading comp and logical reasoning is going to be real.
Exactly. Okay, so at least you have that information. Good or bad, you have it.
At least you got it.
Of course, and of course, as you're going through, until you get the second section, you're not going to. Right.
Yeah. So you basically, unfortunately, you got to try on everything.
Of course. Right. Do you recommend that applicants take the Flex LSAT? In other words, they make sure they get it done before we move to the LSAT, before August, as soon as possible, essentially? Or should they wait for the traditional LSAT?
That's a great question. I mean, all else being equal, I think anybody would prefer to do it without the experimental section and be done by June. But I would not recommend that you rush it if you're not fully ready by June.
Of course.
And that additional 2 months could make a big difference.
Yeah. As with almost anything in admissions. I mean, one of the things I always tell applicants is, they'll ask, when should I apply? I'll say apply as early as possible, provided you don't compromise the quality of your application. And the same as with the test taking experience.
Yes, that is an enormous caveat that everyone should pay close attention to in all of these contexts, right? I mean, doing it earlier, getting it done sooner. I think people just want to be done with this stuff and get on to the actual grad school they're applying to, right? The law school they're applying to. This is just a means to an end. But these things are incredibly important. Your LSAT score matters a great deal. And so don't rush to get it done by June just to do the 3-section version, when an extra 2 months could make an enormous difference in getting a higher LSAT score, getting more scholarship money, getting into better schools. And that June versus August thing, the August LSAT's in mid-August. You get your results back at the end of August. You can still apply at the beginning of the cycle either way.
Right. And you'll apply knowledgeably, knowing what your LSAT score is, as opposed to just kind of applying in the dark.
Exactly.
Right. How should applicants adjust their prep in light of the additional section and increased length of the LSAT versus the LSAT Flex if they're not ready to take it by July?
I would say just practice like it's going to be on game day. So do 4-section practice test sittings, splice in an unscored extra section from another exam, and place that extra section in any position, first, second, third, or fourth. It's kind of funny, actually, but the released prep tests from the past are all 4-section exams, because the exam used to be 4 scored sections plus that 5th unscored experimental section. So if you want to insert logical reasoning as your extra section for the new LSAT starting in August 2021, you've already got it built in with all of the previously released exams. There's nearly 100 like that. But you don't want to only use logical reasoning as your extra section. So you should also make some little Frankenstein exams, inserting logic game sections from other prep tests or reading comp sections from other prep tests. But you do that, you'll be ready.
Great tip. Now, LSAC indicated it may need to adjust the score release date, given anticipated higher volume for the August administration specifically, probably because you will have the score before you actually can start applying. Now, how much longer do you think it will take to get the score if you take the August test?
I would say you'll probably get it within 3 weeks. It used to be a 3-week wait to get your score back.
3 weeks of the test date.
Yeah, so 3 weeks since you took it, or 3 weeks of that testing period. So 3 weeks. It used to be, of course, pre-flex. It was on a single day. It wasn't like you had a whole week of flex administrations like we have now with the online LSAT. So you get it about 3 weeks later, and they wouldn't even be precise about the date. They would have an estimated release date, but then release it randomly early. So everybody was super stressed about whenever it would come out. With the flex, they've adjusted things with the new LSAC president, Kelly Testy, who's great. They've been much more better at communicating with students, and they've been saying 2 weeks from now you'll get it. They actually stick to the date. That's very comforting for folks to not be frantically checking their LSAC accounts or their emails and stuff.
Yeah. Reflexively doing so.
Yes, really, definitely. I mean, but as they're changing things up a little bit, I think they're giving themselves a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of a buffer, because they also want to calibrate things a bit more with the longer testing sitting, the potentially higher volume of people. They might have some more work to do on their end. So they're saying maybe a little bit longer. I'm guessing 3 weeks at most, though. Also, law schools really want those scores. They want to get moving on applications. And LSAC really is an organization meant to serve law schools. And so if law schools want something and they're all in the same boat on that thing, I think LSAC's going to really work hard to deliver it. So I'd expect at the very least within like the first week of September. But I'm sure they'll be working around the clock to get them out.
Right. Okay. Now, the undergrad world and parts of the graduate world have really been rocked as COVID accelerated or moved different programs to test optional or to issuing test waivers. I mean, on the undergraduate, I think we're now at 40% or 50% or something like that. I understand that 60 of the top 100 MBA programs are now either test optional or issuing test waivers. There are a couple of medical schools that have gone test optional, which is kind of mind blowing. Do you think that might, and obviously some law schools have decided to accept the GRE. Do you see that happening in the law school world, and why or why not?
Well, I think there's two questions here, right? Because one is about will they start taking the GRE as well? And then separately, will they go test optional entirely? So with regard to the GRE, I do expect that more and more law schools will take the GRE as a way to widen the applicant pool. I mean, they can, of course, evaluate folks on other criteria like their GPAs, like their application essays and such, and they can choose very carefully whom they choose to admit with their GRE score as opposed to the standard, which is the LSAT. So I think that on a long enough timeline, virtually every law school will take the GRE as well, especially once Harvard start and make that big announcement, then many other schools followed suit shortly thereafter.
Oh, yeah.
If Harvard does it, then it must be okay, right? And they also feel, I think they'd like to be able to widen the pool and take more applicants. That increases their selectivity, if nothing else. So
of course,
I think there's a strong incentive to do it simply for competitive benefit over other law schools. So I think we'll certainly see every law school or most law schools take it eventually. Test optional is a different story, though, because in part, the American Bar Association requires schools to use a valid and reliable admission test. For, I think, most of the time that we've been around, it's been the LSAT is the main game in town, right? GRE is a fairly new entrant. And is it valid or reliable? I mean, that's debatable, but it seems to be that they're accepting that. It's no one's going to shut down a law school for doing the GRE instead. But test optional altogether, I think, is tough to sell. I've seen a couple of. Have you seen it? I think there was a school in Arizona that said that they consider the first semester of law school to be the best possible test for how you would do in law school.
So in other words, they're not requiring transfer students to have the LSAT anymore?
No, they were actually accepting students provisionally based on their performance during the first semester of 1L. And they said, well, if you can cut it that way, then we will take you for the remainder of the 3 years.
And I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, I thought it was a very creative interpretation of valid and reliable admission test. Yeah. And they got away with it from what I've seen. I didn't see anything saying that it wasn't going to work. Of course, this was with a very small number of students. I think it might have been only for their own school's undergraduates. So it was maybe a pilot program or mini pipeline of sorts. It wasn't like they were opening this up to the entire world.
Yeah.
I have my concerns about it, though, because if you don't do well, then you just spent the first semester's tuition and have nothing to show for it if you don't get taken for the rest of it. Right. So I have some concerns regarding that, and I'm not sure that a lot of schools would go that route, but that could be one pathway to standardize test optional, but still technically falling within what the ABA requires under, again, what I consider a creative interpretation there.
Again, I don't know how, obviously the ABA's approval is critical. That's the accrediting body. I know in the business school world, several programs have started issuing test waivers. So basically what they say there is, you fill out a form and you show that, and without the GMAT or the GRE, that you are qualified that you're likely to do well in business school. Okay, based on your performance in college, based on your work performance, they have good confidence that you're going to perform academically. And then the school will issue a waiver, and you don't need to take the GRE or the GMAT to get in. And so that's kind of a middle place between test required and test optional. No test required. Again, it's a middle spot. And it's, again, from my perspective, seeing different graduate programs, it's really interesting to see how they're all handling this, because on one hand, they want to increase access. They also want to stay competitively exclusive. So if they waive the test, application volume soars, and if they don't, students are happier. Applicants are happier. They don't have to take the test. They don't have to spend money on the test. They don't have to spend money on prep. But it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out.
No, I really like that idea, actually, because there are a lot of students who, for whatever reason, they just don't do well on standardized tests. It could be nerves, it could be anxiety, it could be any one of a number of factors, but they've demonstrated their aptitude and their ability to succeed in law school based on some other factor. It could be work experience, it could be their GPA. And so if they can show, for example, that their SAT or ACT performance did not accurately predict how they would do in undergrad, and they killed it in undergrad and got a great GPA, then why wouldn't we think they could do similar in law school as well?
Right.
The one concern I have, which I think is why the ABA requires this test, is bar passage rates. So if the bar exam exists and it's required to practice as an attorney, then we want to make sure you're going to do well on that. And the LSAT has some correlation with first-year law school grades, which in turn can translate into bar passage to some extent, but these aren't the strongest correlations in the world. So I could see why in many, many cases it wouldn't line up. And I actually think there's far too much emphasis placed on standardized tests in general. Mm-hmm. And to some extent, they're a necessary evil, but I'd love to see alternatives like what you laid out.
Right. And I think that the law school you mentioned is say, look, if you think, it's kind of putting your money where your mouth is to the student. If you think you can do well in law school, show us and we'll admit you.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, at the same time, though, I still wonder about, on the one hand, the law school gets that money, so they have incentive to offer that program. And then secondly, I mean, a lot of students desperately want to go to law school, and then they're taking out big loans. And so I could see some of these bottom of the barrel law schools, and I'm not going to name any names here, but there are certain schools that I think don't have the students' best interests in mind as much as they have their tuition dollars in mind. And they need those students to make their overhead. And some schools are in trouble. And so they're looking to get dollars wherever they can get them. And that's where you have certain things like these Masters of Legal Studies degrees, for example, that I'm not sure are a good substitute for getting a JD.
Right. No, clearly. Great points. Thank you. What are your top tips for people taking the LSAT remotely?
I would say my biggest tip is to really simulate the testing environment as much as you possibly can. So making sure that
practice exams?
Practice tests, yes. So making sure you're taking your practice tests in the same room you'll take the actual thing, making sure your internet connection is strong, and if not, reaching out to LSAC about getting an alternative place to take it. They'll give you what's the word? They'll reimburse you if you want to take it at a hotel, for example, with a good internet. So I'd say wired internet if possible, and making sure no one else is using it at the same time. So make sure it's strong enough, because there's nothing more frustrating than getting kicked out in the middle of a timed exam setting on the real thing. So simulate, practice, and make sure that you're used to the online LSAT format. So LSAC created Law Hub, aka Official LSAT Prep Plus, where you can take the majority of LSATs with the same look and feel, the same style as you'll do an actual test day. And so don't do the majority of your studying in books when the exam has changed format completely.
Makes sense. Great tips. One question that occurred to me just now is, I mean, it does happen that there's a power outage or your internet goes down. In other words, somebody can do everything you said, right? They can do practice tests in the room they're going to take the exam. They can work on a wired internet connection. And still something will happen. What happens then? What do they do?
Yeah, that's the worst thing, because you could do everything right and then something happens from a totally outside external factor that just ruins it for that day. What you do is reach out to LSAC immediately, ask the proctor to make a note of it as well, if possible, depending on what happened. And then in some cases, LSAC will set up an alternative date in the short term. So maybe you could take it a week or two later. Alternatively, you might not be able to take it until the next sitting, which is typically going to be a month later, maybe two. But that's really the best they can do for you, unfortunately, in most cases. And they can't undo what happened already. And a power outage, of course, is out of their control. And hey, I mean, there are things that go wrong on ProctorU's end as well. And ProctorU, by the way, is the organization administering and proctoring the online LSAT. So there could be things that happen that are at their fault as well. Either way, reach out to LSAC, reach out multiple times if necessary. Hopefully they'll make it right. They don't always get back to people quickly, though, just because of the volume of people they're dealing with. But keep following up, keep calling, call first thing in the morning if you can, because that's the best chance of getting through to them without a long wait time.
Okay, great advice. What would you have liked me to ask you that I haven't asked you about the return of the LSAT and the demise of lsat-flex?
I mean, honestly, Linda, I think you really covered everything. I loved the questions. I think we hit it from every angle.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your taking time to speak with me. Where can listeners and LSAT test takers learn more about your coaching service?
Yeah, sure. So again, I'm Steve Schwartz. I run the LSAT blog and the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. I'm pretty easy to reach through all of these platforms. I've also got a free, easy LSAT cheat sheet folks can download at bit.ly/LSAT cheat sheet, all lowercase, and that's the best way to get started.
Okay, great. We're going to link in the show notes at accept.com/415 to the websites and resources that Steve just mentioned, as well as to other links to related articles and interviews, including previous interviews with Steve. Listener, thank you too for joining Steve Schwartz and me for our 415th episode. Quick reminder, grab your free copy of the Law School Admissions Guide, 8 Tips for Success. Accept its informative free guide for law school applicants at accept.com/415 download. And a final request, if you find the show worthwhile, please share the good word by leaving a review on iTunes. Your doing so helps us spread the good news about Admission Straight Talk. And you can leave the review at lovethepodcast.com/AST. And by the way, doing so will also enroll you in our lovethepodcast.com contest. Okay. And winners will receive a free consultation with me, 20-minute consultation. Thanks again for coming. This is Admission Straight Talk produced by Accepted, and I am your host, Linda Abraham. I'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.